We have a garden at our house, and one of the things that's true about a garden is there are things that come to an end. Earlier in the season, we planted peas, sugar snap peas, and we got some of them, enjoyed them, but by now, those plants are done. If you have a garden, you know that there are some plants that have a season, and then the time comes for them when they are no longer living. Now, there's other plants that are still coming up, have yet to produce, but that particular one, boy, it is done. And it is time for something else to come. Endings happen in all times in our lives, in all places in our lives as well. Our lives, in fact, are made up of transitions. This is going to be our focus for this series over the next several weeks. Over and over, we experience periods of changes in our bodies, in our relationships, in our work. In practically every aspect of our lives, things change, and we go through the process of transition. Here at this church, it is true for the pastoral transition. Keith and Maria Campbell, for our family, for this congregation, things changed this summer. We moved out of our home by Lake Shawnee into our new home off of Indian Hills. Pastor Maria and Keith moved out of their home here into their new home in the Kansas City area. Years of ministry came to a close. There was a guest preachers at each of these places, and here I am on my fourth Sunday here. As we find in Ecclesiastes, there's a season for everything and a time for every matter under the heavens. This is true for our families, for our church, and for our community. There are times of transition. There are times of change. There is death, there is new life, and there are every change along the way. This is the first in a series of sermons which designed around three parts of every transition: an end, a neutral zone, or a space of wilderness in between, and then finally, new beginnings. This model of transition is outlined by William Bridges in one of my favorite books about change in our lives, Transitions. Do we have the book cover? I don't know if we have that picture. The book cover, yeah. Maybe that's... Okay, we've got this one. Okay, so it's a book by William Bridges called Transitions. In this classic book, he describes this process that each of us goes through, no matter what the ending is in our life. And I'll be using some of this material in the sermon for today. I haven't found a better book that talks about transitions in our lives. I've read it over and over again: when our children were born, when we moved from town to town, when Nicole and I were married, and I've looked at it again more recently. The model which Bridges presents in his book is shown here, that there's three parts of every transition: endings, a neutral zone, and new beginnings. And if you look at this from the y-axis, the vertical lines here, the vertical is importance. Near the beginning of it, and the x-axis from left to right is time. And so you see at the beginning of a transition, endings are most important. And yet there's some aspects of being in between and even some new beginnings that are present right at the very beginning. As time goes on, you see that the neutral zone becomes more important, while there are still aspects of endings and new beginnings that are present, and finally, new beginnings become to be most important. Though there's still parts of being in the middle and parts of endings that are still sticking around. Endings and neutral zone and beginnings. This is the pattern of transition, and yet the transitions in our lives don't always take nice, easy, neat steps. Transition happens at a different pace for each person. You might find yourself in one place on this, while someone going through something very similar is in a different place, and that's okay. That is okay. Next week during the sermon, we'll take a closer look at the neutral zone, and the week after that, we'll consider new beginnings. And today, I want to invite us to reflect on endings and how they can set the stage for new growth in the future. There are many stories in the Bible about endings. The end of the wait for a baby by Abraham and Sarah. The end of slavery for the people of Israel. The end of the wait for the Messiah with the birth of Jesus. And of course, perhaps the most famous ending in the Bible, Jesus' death on the cross. Hear these words from Luke chapter 23. It was about noon, and darkness covered the whole earth until about 3 o'clock, while the sun stopped shining. Then the curtain in the sanctuary tore down the middle. Crying out in a loud voice, Jesus said, "Father, into your hands I entrust my life." After he said this, he breathed his last. Now, I want you to imagine this scene for the disciples. They had left the life that they knew. They had followed after Jesus for 3 years. He had done amazing, incredible things. He had taught them ways to live about in God's kingdom. He healed, he shared his life. And they may have been thinking, now that we're in Jerusalem, this is it. It's going to be time when the Romans would leave and that Christ would reign, but then it was all over. Jesus was nailed to the cross and breathed his last. And sometimes endings in our life come just that fast. The death of a loved one, the end of a relationship, and notice that you've been let go from your job. Life is one way. We're moving forward. Things are looking good. And then that way of life has come to an end. We'd hoped, we had planned, we had expected something in our lives, in our work, in our relationships, but then an ending has come. Something is over and done. And some events in our life are perhaps easier to recognize as endings, and others are perhaps a bit more difficult to recognize that something is ending. When our first child was born, our son was born, Nicole and I were both serving as associate pastors at a church together. And I remember one Sunday after worship, we both had something to do in a different part of the building. And we were both about to head our different directions. And then I realized, here's John sitting here in the car seat. Someone has to take our child. We can't just go off in opposite directions doing our own thing. Here was the new birth, a new beginning in many different ways, and yet it was the end of our life as just the two of us. We couldn't just go wherever we wanted, whenever we wanted. Life as a parent is different than life as a couple with no children. It seems like a beginning, but it's also an ending. Consider also perhaps retirement. Maybe you have come to that place. Many times people look forward to this time for decades, and yet when the time comes, it may also bring a sense of ending and loss. It can bring the end of a daily routine, the end of a source of income, the end of social connections that you may have had at work. And I wonder, what endings have you experienced in your life? What endings maybe are you going through right now? We have endings over and over again throughout our lives, and yet that doesn't mean that we always deal with them very well. As humans, we don't really like endings. We want to avoid the loss and the grief that comes during these times in our life. The disciples, whenever Jesus warned them that he was going to be put to death, they ignored it. They didn't understand it. They didn't want to go there. And the same for us. We don't want to go there when things end. We can be afraid of the emptiness and the pain of the ending, and perhaps scared that we won't find our way out of the transition. How will we make sense of our lives when this thing has ended? And sometimes we try to avoid endings by jumping too quickly into something new and denying that there's been an ending at all. We can ignore our feelings and our grief, and we may tell ourselves and others, I'm fine, I can outrun this loss. Sometimes we try to avoid endings by pretending that an ending hasn't happened at all. We just keep doing things the way that we've always done them. We pretend nothing has changed. We don't act differently. We don't adapt. We try to avoid it altogether, and yet it won't go away. It's right there. And here's the problem with both of these strategies. They don't work. If we don't engage the loss and the grief and the endings in our life, they can hold us back from moving into the future. They can negatively impact our lives and our relationships. They can continue to shape our lives. We may not be able to embrace a new beginning if we do not first embrace the ending. So how do we do that? How do we embrace the endings in our lives? The author William Bridges writes that there are at least 4 ways to embrace our endings, and they all begin with disidentification, disenchantment, disorientation, and disengagement. It's not a tidy step-by-step process, but they're each aspects of the ending process that we go through in a change. And I want to invite you to reflect on your own endings as I describe these for you. One aspect of endings is disidentification. We may lose some of the familiar ways that we identify who we are and understand our lives in relationship to other people. We might even say, well, my life is falling apart. And that's true. Our old roles, our old behaviors, and our old relationships may literally be falling apart when endings come. Another aspect of endings is disenchantment. It's when we feel in between, kind of in limbo between two worlds. Consider times of change for our country. September 11th, Kennedy's assassination, Pearl Harbor. What we knew about our lives was no longer seemed to be so. The world that we lived in is not here anymore, and yet the world that we're moving into isn't quite here yet. We can't go back to the way things were before. And the same process happens in all the endings of our lives. When we lose a job, when a loved one dies or leaves us, or any other ending, we can find ourselves disenchanted in between, trying to make sense of things. Disorientation, we used to know what was up and what was down. We were able to orient our lives to a past and a future, and yet in the ending, we may find ourselves confused. There may be a sense of emptiness. We used to have plans for the future, but when an ending comes, we may have to let go of those plans, even though we might try to hold on to them so tightly. They might not make sense anymore. And finally, disengagement. Whether it's a vacation, taking a few days away, or even a bit of time in each day, time away helps make space for us to grieve, to recognize that an ending has come, to let go of the old patterns and the roles that used to sustain and keep us together. And these are some of the ways that we can embrace the endings in our lives. Robert Frost, the great American poet, describes the hope in endings in this way: that you would be lost enough to find yourself. Lost enough to find yourself. When we embrace endings, we will struggle. We will be confused. We will feel empty and have to deal with the grief and loss. And yet when we come to grieve our loss and embrace our endings, we may become fertile soil out of which a new beginning will come. The good news is that endings are not the end. The end of Jesus' life on the cross led to the resurrection, and the resurrection brings hope for all of the endings in our lives. As Jesus reminds us, when you are feeling something, ask, seek, and knock, and it will be found. So don't avoid the endings in your lives. Engage them. Go after them. Live into them. Recognize the reality of loss. Take time to grieve so that you can experience renewal and new beginnings. Because when we let go of the previous life, that just isn't there anymore, and lean into the endings of our lives, it's then that we find new beginnings and new life. There is a season for everything, and a time for every matter under the heavens. A time for endings, a time for beginnings, a time for grieving loss, and a time for being transformed in resurrection. Jesus knows this path. Jesus knows you. And he invites us to take his hand and walk into the endings we face, so that out of the ashes of our loss will come new hope, new life, and new beginnings. Will you pray with me? Jesus, we want to walk with you through all the circumstances of our lives. And we ask that you help us recognize when an end has come, to lean into it, to live into it, and to walk with you every step of the way. Give us strength and give us courage and help us to follow you. In your holy name, amen.